All right, last week you watched a little intro to leading up to the United States joining World War II. We're going to come back and revisit that a little bit. I wanted you to watch those videos because of the visuals of the map, and he does a really good job explaining when things happened and what happened. And I kind of want to back up for just a little bit, and then we're going to keep going into World War II. All right, let's talk about the two sides of the war. So first of all, we have the Axis powers, and the Axis powers are Germany, Italy, and Japan. And then I put USSR in parentheses. So the USSR is what we would call Russia. And remember that they started off the war in cahoots with Germany. They signed that Molotov-Ribbentrop, I think is how you say it. Not necessarily a treaty, but it was a non-aggression act that they had signed this paperwork to stay together. But we know from watching last week's video that towards as the war progresses, Hitler invades Germany, then Germany invades Russia, and Russia kind of flips sides there. So before the U.S. joins, the Allies were Britain, France, and China. The League of Nations made several attempts at peace and disarmament in the 1920s and the 1930s, pre-World War II. One failed attempt took place in 1932, a thing called the Geneva Conference. It was in Switzerland. That should say 60, not 16. 60 nations met to discuss general disarmament. Germany, which had joined the League of Nations in 1926, pleaded with the other nations to reduce all of their armaments to the level set for Germany by the Treaty of Versailles. Remember, after World War I, the Treaty of Versailles demanded that Germany lower the amount of munitions that they had. Germany is asking that all nations do that here. France, among many other nations, refused, and this Geneva Conference ended in failure. Now, Germany was being pretty smart, because if they could get other countries to disarm, they're going to be 2 steps ahead when it comes to the upcoming war. Now, let's talk about all of these countries not all of them. Let's talk about the big countries that were involved. First of all, Russia. Russia's not Russia. It's the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. We call it the USSR. Joseph Stalin is the leader of the Communist Party there. And the Soviet Union, he took power in 1927. And the reality is, Joseph Stalin was probably just as terrible as Adolf Hitler was. The difference is that Joseph Stalin killed all of the people in his own country without stepping outside of that. I mean, he was a mastermind. When it came to him taking over, basically he came in and said, anybody who is against me is dead. And he came in and began to wipe out anybody who stood against him. He had this 5-year plan, several 5-year plans. At least 10 million Russian peasants died as a result of Stalin's collectivization program. Few people in the West were kind of realized the extent of Stalin's cruel dictatorship. Because it was internal. He wasn't trying to step out of his borders. Hitler became so well known because he was going outside of his own people. But Joseph Stalin was able to take absolute and complete control. And after his 5-year plans were put into action and he wiped everyone out, it was pretty easy for him, because all that were left were supporters, or people who were too terrified not to support him. In Italy, we have a guy named Benito Mussolini. He comes in, he marches in on Rome, seizes the power of the government in 1922. He, same thing, ruthlessly crushed all opposition and transformed Italy into a totalitarian fascist state. Now, fascism is it exercises total control of political, economic, cultural, religious, and social activities. It does permit some private enterprise, but it really does strictly regulate those businesses that are privately owned. And he comes in, he promises all of the Italians to end inflation and unemployment, and makes all of these grand promises and becomes a very strong leader. World War I left Germany completely defeated. They were in ruins. They had that enormous amount of $33 billion of debts. For several years, the nation is struggling until 1923. Germany finally defaults on the loan payments. And Germany had just begun to recover when the Great Depression hit. And the reality is, it wasn't just a Great Depression in the United States. And I mentioned this a little bit last week, but if the American people can no longer purchase products from other countries, their sales are going to plummet, and it hit the whole world, and Germany felt it big time. They had massive runaway inflation, widespread unemployment, some economic hardships, and it really left an open door for someone like Adolf Hitler to come in. He was the leader of the National Socialist German Workers' Party. We call that the Nazi Party. And he came in promising protection, promising prosperity, and people just loved him. By 1934, Hitler had transformed Germany into a totalitarian state. He called himself Der Führer. I don't say that right because I don't know German very well. At all. And that just means the leader. He, like fascism, Nazism is a form of socialism, but the difference is it relies heavily on terrorist aggression, fanatical racism, and an anti-democratic nationalism. Hitler convinced the people of Germany that there was this international conspiracy of Jewish bankers, Western capitalists, which would mostly be from Britain, France, and the United States, and that communists were out to conquer Germany. Then once he gets the people to believe that the reason they're starving, the reason they have no work, the reason they have no money, the reason that they're freezing because they can't afford coal is because of the Jews, number one, and number two, because of all of those Westerners, then it doesn't take long. They're hungry, they're cold, they're now depending on the government to feed them and to clothe them. And then convinced that everyone else is the bad guy, he begins to use fear and distrust that he had created to turn Germans against the Jewish neighbors, and then he was able to extend control over everything. And it all started with this brainstorming that the reason you're hungry, the reason you're cold, the reason your kids don't have enough food is because of other people. Not the Germans, it's the Jews' fault. It's the Jews' fault. It's the Jews' fault. It's the Westerners' fault. And the people just fell right into it. Hitler's autobiography, Mein Kampf, which means My Struggle, reveals very much about his philosophy of life, his drive for power. This was actually written in 1924. Hitler was in prison. He had been part of an insurrection against the German government. He's thrown in jail. While he is in jail, he has this epiphany and he writes this book called Mein Kampf. I've never read it. I probably should, and maybe I'll put it on my list this year to read. My goal is to read 100 books, but I'm not positive I want to jump into this. I know people who have read it, who have told me that he was a crazy genius, that the things that he is writing are absolutely genius level, but that he's crazy. Which makes sense. We already know he's crazy, but here's the thing, and this is real. This is real, okay? And I know that it sounds a little dramatic, but I think the more that I've studied this is absolutely true. So basically, Hitler combines Darwinism and socialism. And if we go all the way back to Darwinism, The Origins of Species, Charles Darwin, and this idea that you have an evolutionary cycle. And Darwin himself, in his Origins of Species, begins to teach that there are groups of people who are not fully evolved. In the very beginning, one of them was African Americans, black-skinned people. They're just not fully evolved. And this was an idea that was being taught in Darwinism. And so Hitler takes this idea, and this idea of socialism, that the government should be in control of everything, And he begins to say that the Germans are the ones that have evolved into a superior or a master race, the Aryan race, they're the master race. They're destined to rule the world, period. They are to rule all of it. And in order to assure the survival of the fittest, his idea is we're going to have a war. We're going to eliminate all inferior races because they're just stuck in the evolutionary cycle. And if we can get rid of them or enslave them, then we will have a master superior race, and then we can rule the whole world. And this was, from what I can, again, I've never read Mein Kampf, but from what I have deducted from others who have read it and from studying writings on it, that his whole goal was to create a superior race, and that the survival of the fittest means that the Aryan master race would win. Now, the reality is most high school level books don't discuss this, but he was actually part German, part Jewish. His grandfather or his great grandfather was a Jew, and from what I have read, he assaulted him as a young boy, and that sort of spawned in him a hatred towards that whole race, which would make sense, I suppose. So that's not a textbook fact, but that's what I have read in a couple of places. But regardless of the reasoning behind it, he has decided that the Aryan race is going to be the perfect race. He has convinced Germany as a whole. Now, I'm sure not everybody believed it, but as a whole, Germany has been taught for several years that their problems are because of the Jews and because of the Westerners. And because we already know the end of the story, it doesn't work out well for those non-Aryans for a little while. All right, I want to come back and talk about Japan for a second. I think that many times it's easy to sort of separate Hitler in Germany is happening at one time, and then everything in Japan is happening at another time. But the reality is they're laying kind of all at the same time. Hitler's going over and taking over pretty much all of Europe. One of the things we did not talk about before was the ease at which he took over so many of those countries. Things like the Netherlands and in Austria, they had already been infiltrated by Nazis within their political realm. So when Hitler marched in, shots weren't fired. Basically, keys of the city were just handed over to Hitler because so many of their political powers were already in cahoots with them. They were already communists, or Nazis, I'm sorry. At the same time, we have Japan on the other side of the United States having issues. After World War I, the leaders of Japan increasingly looked for a military solution to Japan's economic and social problems. They did not have a lot of natural resources in Japan, and he talked about this. I'm going to just touch real quick. They began to look for other areas to take over to increase their natural resources. Manchuria becomes a very important part of this puzzle. The land was extremely important to Japan. It has abundant natural resources. It's a strategic location as a base from which they can then conquer and control all of northern China. Their whole goal was to take over China and then begin world domination as well. And so that becomes really important as far as Japan is considered. And remember, he talked about those wars and excuse me, the Chinese Civil War, the Second Sino-Japanese War, and that many people believe that was really the first step of World War II happening. But there are now conflicts between Japan and the United States, which again, you talked about that last week in that video, so I just wanted to touch on Manchuria again real quick and move on. All right, we need to talk for a second about the Munich Pact. So you have the Prime Minister of Britain, Prime Minister Chamberlain, and Premier, I'm assuming you say his name, Edouard Daladier, it's French, so I don't know, of France. They fly to Munich, Germany. In the fall of 1838, they're going to talk to Hitler and Mussolini because they're working together, remember, because of the Non-Aggression Act. Hitler's like, look, there's this section called the Sudetenland. That's my last claim, he says. This is my last claim in Europe. I promise after this, I'm done. And I'll just go back and stay within my territory. So on September 29th, 1938, we give Germany this land. The Munich agreement is signed. However, by March, so it's signed in fall of 38. By March of 39, Germany has already broken this pact. We're trying to do everything we can. Remember, the United States is neutral and it stays neutral, and we're doing everything we can to alleviate or to try to stay away from war. Everyone can see it coming, but we're just doing our best to keep it as far away as possible. Now, when the Munich Pact was broken in March, it did not take terribly long. By September 3rd, 1939, France and Britain declared war on Germany. World War II officially began after they call it a war machine because Hitler had such a phenomenally well-organized military system. They called it a war machine. On September 1st, 1939, Hitler invaded Poland. And it did not take very long, 2 days. September 3rd, France and Britain declared war on Germany, and World War II officially began then. Let's talk about some things that are happening in the war. Now, some of these are German words, and I'm not going to say them correctly, so just bear with me. I can't speak English correctly, much less German. All right, the very first thing that happens, the Nazis take Poland by storm. They don't hesitate. They march in, and there are these things called Stuka. They're dive bombers. Destroy the weak Polish Air Force on the ground. At the same time, you have this thing called Panzer, which is a tank. That should not say dash, it should be a dash. Tank divisions overwhelm the Polish cavalry, and those are the foot soldiers. Within 4 weeks, all of Poland is under Nazi control. When Hitler marches into a country, one of the things that I've read over and over and over is how quickly he moves. And again, that war machine that's so well pieced together, and the ability that this man has over the military to just march in and wipe out countries within just weeks. There's a word called blitzkrieg. It means a lightning war, and that is how he fought this. He came in and it was like lightning. Bam, 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 bam. Just takes it over. Two of the most infamous concentration camps, Treblinka and Auschwitz, were located in Poland. And we're not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about that because you guys just read Night, and so you've had a pretty clear picture of the Holocaust and what was happening. We'll touch on it a little bit next week. But because of that discussion you guys just ended, we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on it. Now, we got to talk about two specific things. And I'm sure that I'm not going to say this right, but I think it's Luftwaffe. That is the German Air Force, and they were the superior Air Force. Well, they thought they were. The Royal Air Force is called the RAF. And these two guys are going to really hit heads as we go. And this Royal Air Force is absolutely one of the coolest things during World War II and one of the most dominant forces. They did some amazing things, and I would say without the RAF, World War II would have ended very, very differently. One of the most significant events of the RAF was happened at a place called Dunkirk. The German blitzkrieg was so swift and so overwhelming when they came into France that the British and French troops who had assembled in northern France, so they know Hitler's coming in, they set up some blockades in the north of France to block the Nazi advance, but Hitler comes in so hard and so fast that they're soon pushed to the coastline of this little bitty port of Dunkirk. It's on the English Channel, and they're stuck. You have hundreds of thousands of British and French soldiers who are literally at the waterfront. They've been pushed back, and they're just waiting to be massacred by the Nazis. But the RAF, in this daring and courageous effort, really one of the most heroic things in all of World War II, they're able to hold off the Germans just long enough for hundreds of small British ships, some were military, some were civilians, are able to get 300,000 British and French soldiers across the channel to safety. There is a movie called Dunkirk, and I can't recommend it to you to watch because it does have bad words in it, but it is such a good representation of this event. It's so good. And the heroism of the RAF is absolutely astounding. However, while 300,000 British and French soldiers are able to get across the channel safely, Hitler has pushed everyone out, and the French actually end up surrendering to the Nazis on June 22nd, 1940. From what I remember, I'm pretty sure that, I'm not pretty sure, I know that the railroad car that Germany signed the armistice for World War I, Hitler had that exhumed or pulled back out, and that is where he made France surrender to him in World War II. Just a little stab in the back for him. So now that France has been taken, Hitler now devises a plan to invade and conquer Great Britain. He has a plan called Operation Sea Lion. Now, according to this plan, the Luftwaffe would destroy the Royal Air Force, the RAF, within approximately 1 month. They were just going to come in, and the plan is to just constant air raids. Every night, every day, just coming in and bombing so they could destroy the Royal Air Force. They understood that that had to be the first thing to take out, because even though they were absolutely outnumbered, the RAF was a force to be reckoned with. Then, the German task force would cross the English Channel and invade Britain. And listen, it was a perfect plan, because the Luftwaffe had 2,000 warplanes. The RAF only had about 400. Number-wise, it's evident that Germany's going to win. However, Germany sort of underestimated the resolve of the freedom-loving British to fight. Now, things took a change in May of 1940. Prime Minister Chamberlain resigns. Winston Churchill becomes Prime Minister of Great Britain. Winston Churchill is the only person, well, one of the few people who understood Adolf Hitler. In the very beginning, before he had any power, Winston Churchill was telling people, we've got to watch out for this guy. He is going to come in, he is going to take over, and it's going to be bad. And very few people listen to him. But now that Adolf Hitler has taken power and is going crazy and is ruling everything, Winston Churchill becomes the Prime Minister of Great Britain. And he realized, excuse me, the only hope for preserving freedom in Europe was to make a valiant stand against the Nazis. Not just playing defense, but jumping into offensive. Hitler unleashed bombers in July of 1940, and he started. All right, that past slide kind of glitched out there at the end. I'm not going to redo the whole slide, so we're going to just sort of pick up here. So, Churchill said, we have got to take a stand against the Nazis. Now, at the same time, Hitler, July 1940, Hitler began what's called the London Blitz. And for 3 months, the Luftwaffe bombed London. 10,000 bombs fell on the city in just September alone. This was like constant bombing. Now, the RAF, even with their only 400 planes, was able to ward off the attacks. And they were able to inflict such heavy losses to the 2,000 ships that Hitler had no choice but to call off the invasion indefinitely. And he was unable to take over London, which means he was unable to take over Britain, right? Now, after this London Blitz was over, Winston Churchill has a quote. He said, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." Again, you have 2,000 planes versus 400 planes, and these 400 RAF fighter flyers, that's not the right word, but you know what I mean, was able to fight off this immense war machine. And so few people were able to save all. And I'm telling you, if Hitler had taken over London and then been able to take over Britain, it would have been a very, very different ending to this story. So then Hitler has an idea, and we hit on this last week a little bit. He decides he's going to invade Russia of the summer of that apparently 1941 is what that should say. Hitler amasses over 100 divisions of men. So between 1 and 2 million men. They crossed the Soviet border on, I believe it was June 22nd, 1941. Now this absolutely undoes that Molotov-Ribbentrop Non-Aggression Act, and really crosses off the alliance with Russia. And most historians will say that this was the beginning of Hitler's downfall. And we'll see that things slowly digress for Hitler. Now, this whole time, within the United States, we have attempted to stay neutral, okay? And we're not going to really define all of these, but we have a Neutrality Act of 1837. Then we have to change that and up it. We have another Neutrality Act of 1939. One of the biggest things that caused issues in the United States is this thing called Lend-Lease Act. In March of 1941, after about 2 months of a pretty intense debate, Congress gave the president powers that allowed him to sell, to lend, to lease, or otherwise dispose of any war materials to any nation whose defense he felt to be vital to American security. Now, this causes hostility between the United States and, that should not say Axis nations. That should say Axis nations. Basically, here's what happens. Congress gives the president, and I don't remember how much what the money amount is, but we have this Lend-Lease Act. The president has power to sign an act with any country to sell them armaments or food or provision, to lease them items, and that should say lend, not land, to lend them any armaments to any country that he feels would be vital to keep America safe. And what happens then is people like Germany or Japan get a little worried because we have a pretty big asset within ourselves, right? And it really begins to grow some hostility between the United States and these Axis nations. Allied nations begin to come to us and beginning to ask and sort of fight for a Lend-Lease. From what I can tell, from what I've been reading, Hitler even made an attempt to convince us to sign a Lend-Lease Act with them. Obviously, we never fell for that, but this becomes a really big deal and a first step in drawing us into, while we still would be neutral on paper, giving aid to another country sort of is that foot in the door to join the war. All of this time, we are having some trouble with Japan, right? It's all kind of happening all at the same time. And a new leader comes into play. General, I'm not even going to pretend to say his first name, but Tojo comes to power with this very extreme military-controlled system. And there are a ton of conspiracy theories regarding Pearl Harbor. Let me kind of explain what Pearl Harbor was, why it mattered, and then we'll come back to that. Basically, on Sunday morning, December 7th, 1941, just before 8 a.m., Pearl Harbor was bombed by Japan. Now, Pearl Harbor was a Navy base. So it was a Navy base off the coast of California. The Navy loses 18 ships, 170 airplanes, over 3,500 servicemen were killed. It doesn't take long for us to retaliate. December 8th, Congress declares war on Japan. So the next day. And then 3 days later, Germany and Italy declare war on the United States. And the United States declares war on Germany and Italy. And now we're in the middle of a world war. Now, there is a huge conspiracy theory about Pearl Harbor in that people wanted the United States to join the war. The government wanted us to join the war, but we needed more more motive for the United States people to want to join the war. So there's a group of people who thinks that Pearl Harbor was planned, that it was a loud attack so to tick off the Americans enough to allow the United States to go to war. Some people say that it was like we knew Japan was looking at bombing us, and so we sort of dangled Pearl Harbor in front of them to keep them from bombing the mainland of California. So there's all kind of issues and theories about Pearl Harbor. All I know for sure is that it was bombed by Japan and it drew us into the war. Alright, next video we are going to cover what happens after the United States join the war. But for today, make sure you fill in your notes, answer your homework questions, and do your States and Capitals review sheet to turn in next week.